Welcome to our Water for Food Global Institute. This is our first session on the value of water. So just before I introduce our speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about the session and the goals. Water markets and incentive-based systems for water transfers are growing in popularity both in the field and within the policy debate. Water markets are not really anything new, but as technology moves, as policy moves, they are coming to the forefront of the debate. And in particular, they're coming to the forefront of the debate about how you allocate water between agriculture, the environment, and urban uses. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about water markets, water transfers, and incentive-based water management systems. And there are also important challenges to scaling. So the session today is going to talk about all of these things. It's going to talk about what are the opportunities and the challenges for scaling, what are the particular things that we need to look out for when we consider environmental flows for water markets. We have a great set of speakers that are all actively involved both on the conceptual side and on the ground in understanding water markets. And so we're lucky that they'll be able to share their insights both on the academic side and very much on the practitioner side. We have about 20 minutes for each speaker, and after that there will be an opportunity to ask some synthesis and cross-cutting questions. I'll start with those, but the goal is to give you guys as much time as possible to ask questions, really to try to move the debate forward. So with that said, let me introduce our speakers. We have Tom Iseman, he's going to raise his hand. He's going to be our first speaker. He is the Global Director of Water Scarcity and Market Strategy for the Nature Conservancy. Our second speaker is Richael Young, who is the co-founder and CEO of Mammoth Trading, which is a private water trading company based in Denver. And then our third speaker is Dustin Garrick, who is Associate Professor in the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. Now, I'll say that these are good friends and colleagues. I'm very happy to have them all on stage at the same time. I've worked with all of them over the years. The intellectual capacity will be greatly increased when I step off the stage and they step on. But they each bring different perspectives to the problem. And so I'd encourage the audience to think through how to construct the different pieces that they're hearing in a coherent story. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does this mic? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Thank you all for having me here today. My name is Tom Iseman. As Nick said, I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I work on water issues on our global team. I was reminded here when actually it took me until the conference started to remember that my family is actually from Nebraska. Both of my parents grew up in Fremont, Nebraska, and we still have a lot of family here and a lot of ties here, so it's really nice to be here today. Just to say a bit more about my background, I am with the Nature Conservancy now on our global team. Before that, I was with the Department of the Interior in the Obama administration working on water issues in the western U.S. And before that, I was with the Western Governors Association. And so most of my work has been focused on water scarcity and water allocation issues, primarily in the western U.S. But I do have a global role now with the Nature Conservancy, and I'll talk a little bit about that work and how some of these issues are playing out in other parts of the world. And I think the two things I want to describe, the session being about the value of water, and Nick talked a bit at the introduction about water markets, and I'll talk a little bit about how our work has evolved and in some ways broadened from kind of a narrow definition of looking at water markets to looking at a broader perspective on the value of water, and then the tools you would use to realize those values. And the second thing is that the Nature Conservancy, being a conservation organization, a lot of our focus is on environmental values and ecosystems, but we are recognizing and we know the need to think about, obviously, agriculture and water use and cities and other uses of water, other values of water, and how do we solve for these things together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nature Conservancy and how our mission has evolved to think more broadly about these issues. So this is the agenda. I'm just going to cover 3 topics really. First, just a bit about the Nature Conservancy, who we are and how we work. Second, I'll talk a little bit about what is the challenge, and that's been covered well already this morning. I can fly through those slides because, not surprisingly, everyone has talked about that. And then finally, to talk a little bit about what we're doing about it and how it fits in this broader conversation about the value of water. So first, who we are. We're a global conservation organization. Our mission is about protecting lands and waters and the life that depends on them. We have several thousand people. We're in multiple countries around the world. We're in all 50 states, and many people know us for our work in state chapters and working on land conservation, but really we've broadened our approach and our mission to think more broadly. Water resources is a critical part of what the Nature Conservancy does. And we've really, I'll share a bit in a minute about the way that we're organizing our work, but I think it's reflective of thinking more broadly about this conservation mission. How do we achieve conservation in a complicated, developing world with many needs and values? And this is a slide that shows a little bit about where we work, but more I wanted to share it because it talks about how we think about our work. And these are our 4 priorities as a global conservation organization. I'm going to cheat and look at this because I can't even read my notes, but tackling climate change, protecting land and water, providing food and water sustainably, and building healthy cities. This is how we organize our work in what we call our shared conservation agenda. It's the way that we're setting out our outcomes and measuring our progress in our conservation work. It's interesting, I was hired into a team called Global Water. That team no longer exists. We're now part of the group that's called Providing Food and Water Sustainably. And our leader is named Michael Doan. He came from Monsanto and has really focused his work and his career in agriculture, and it's part of the reason it's exciting for me to be at this event today with Water for Food and with this crowd of experts. I think TNC has recognized our mission on water has to connect with food, and we're organizing ourselves to achieve that function. And it's great to be a part of this conversation here where we can make those connections more explicit. But like I said, most of my work has been in water. And I know a lot of the water managers, water resource professionals, but I don't know as much. They're kind of a group that I've connected with in various ways, but we haven't done as much working with our ag counterparts. And so this is a great way that we're restructured to focus more on that. And also it's another reason it's nice to be here at this event. So that was a bit about the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge and why we're doing this work. And you all have seen this map. It was a different version of the map that other people have shown, but it illustrates the same point, which is a lot of the world is challenged to deal with water scarcity risk. This is from a report that the Nature Conservancy did called WaterShare. It's available online. It's global analysis. About a third of the world is facing water scarcity risk in various kinds of water years. Some it's chronic, some it's during drought years, some it's just during the irrigation season. But in all cases, we're seeing pervasive water scarcity risk and the impacts that it can cause. Obviously, for our focus is to the environment, but for many of these other uses we've described as well, including agriculture and food production. Here are some of the statistics about it. It affects people. Half of the people in the world are at risk of water shortages. From an ecosystems perspective, 1/3 of all rivers, lakes, and aquifers are heavily exploited, with at least 75% of water extracted for human use, which is a startling figure to me. 3/4 of the irrigated land is in danger of losing productivity due to water risk. So that connects us back to food as well. And one of the challenges that we see cutting across all of this is the way that we manage and govern water issues, and it's part of the way that we're thinking about working on these issues. How do we set up a system that's flexible and has the right incentives for people to manage water sustainably through these conditions? So now I'm just going to say a bit about the way we're thinking about this problem and hopefully illustrating some of those ways we're thinking about the value of water and how it can factor into the way that we work on these issues. And this is the way we're describing our program or our approach. Resilient water supply is the name of the strategy in North America. But the important thing here, I think, is the pillars of work, how we're organizing our work. And water markets is a big part of it, as Nick described. Buying and selling water can be an important part of the strategy, moving water according to allocations, working with investors in water. It's important, but it's not the only thing, and that's what we've realized. I've been with the Conservancy for 2 years, and that's not sufficient to achieve our mission. And so the other things that we're looking at are investment in innovation and innovation and infrastructure, excuse me. I was very interested in the comments from Deborah this morning from the Irrigation Association, how they're thinking about this work. And I think there is an opportunity, and we'll talk about some projects where we're working with farmers to make those kinds of investments. We're working with the agricultural supply chain, and so the Nature Conservancy, we have partners in the corporate space in food production, food and beverage, agriculture, technology. Many of these companies are interested in water scarcity risk and how to manage it, and we can partner with them. And then finally, this piece on policy and governance, and that was really more my perspective coming from the governors, and the federal government is thinking about how can we help agencies, and I think in a lot of cases they do want to be helped to figure out how to help, how to provide a framework where people can solve these issues. And so how can we best help these agencies to achieve better outcomes in the way that they govern the resource? And so I'm going to talk now about each of these pillars and describe a little bit about our work in this space. Just to give some examples, the first one being the water markets pillar, and this is kind of that really focused definition of buying and selling water. Many of you know of the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. It's often talked about in cases. I'm sure some of our other panelists will reference this as well. The Nature Conservancy is participating in the dialogue and engaged in the basin, but for our focused strategy, one of the things that we did is establish a fund. Actually, it's an investment fund. It's about a $25 million fund, and what we do is we invest in water rights, actually. Sometimes we use them for environmental purposes. Sometimes we lease them back into the market to other users to generate a return. And so it's looking at a more sustainable model for how you can achieve some of these conservation benefits for the Nature Conservancy, moving from just philanthropy, which is a limited pool of resources to achieve your mission, to thinking about what are more sustainable investment models that we can use to achieve these conservation goals. And actually that fund is performing well, as I understand it. A second pillar is around the technology and infrastructure. How do we work with farmers to improve practices? This is part of what we did at the Department of the Interior. We had a program called Water Smart, where we were investing in infrastructure to try to increase delivery methods, efficiencies. I think there were benefits to the farmers operationally, but also opportunities to create conservation wins as well. And so we're looking at different models for investing in agricultural infrastructure, working with farmers, working with new technologies. And I know there are many companies here at this event that do exactly that. The Irrigation Association obviously representing many of those. So we see opportunities there to make investments in agricultural practices that can yield benefits. As I said, corporate engagement is an important part of the work that we do. It's a place where I hadn't done a lot of work, but I've been so impressed with the way that the Nature Conservancy thinks about these issues and the relationships that we have with these companies. And I pulled this slide from Michael Doan, and it was just one slide. It certainly doesn't capture all of our partnerships, but it's one that illustrates a few of the companies that we work with, but there are many others. And to us, it just opens up an opportunity to I think, get at that broader mission of thinking about not just the environment, but how does it relate to food production in this case in particular, and how can we help to do it more sustainably working together. And so we have partnerships with many of these companies, and it's a big part of the work that we'll be doing going forward. And finally, on policy and governance, and this one goes back to my time at the Department of the Interior. It's been an issue that Interior has been dealing with for many years. This is the Colorado River Basin. There's recently an agreement announced about drought contingency planning. 7 states, 2 countries, federal agencies, water users, all agreeing on new ways to try to reduce risk in the basin. And I think it's a great model. I think it shows the opportunity of working at scale, working at a different kind of scale. One of the things that we see is if you work locally on water, you can miss some of the basin issues or threats that confront you. I think it's thinking long term. And one of the things that I've recognized coming from the federal government is that it had to be locally driven. And that's a place where I think the Nature Conservancy's history and strength can shine. Is a lot of our work has been community-based, it's locally oriented, it's about building partnerships. And that's how something like this happens, is when you have the water users talking to the states who are talking to the federal agencies to endorse this kind of approach. And when we talk about policy in the Nature Conservancy, I think a lot of people will think federal legislation or international forums, but certainly in water, I think most of the work has to be local, and that's the way that we're approaching this pillar of work, is thinking about how do we engage with these partners to find better ways to manage and allocate and administer the resource. So it's really kind of a small p policy, it's a local policy, but it's part of the way we're approaching the issue, and I think an important part. And just to kind of complete that story about how we think about our work, my title coming in was about water markets. And it's just become clear how much broader we need to think if we're going to try to take on this issue. That it's not just about markets, it's about all these other interventions, it's about all these other partners, it's about all these other users, it's about all these other values. And how do we design our work so we're meeting people in these places to accomplish this broader goal towards sustainability? So that was the end of my remarks. I do provide my contact information here. I know we're going to have some discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to that and glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so I think we'll hold questions until the end and then do them in cross-cutting fashion. So this is a good time to acknowledge the USDA in particular, through its Office of Environmental Markets and the Office of the Chief Economist. They've been supporting both the Institute as a conference and then the research on water markets that we've been doing. Our next speaker will talk about some of that research, among other things. So again, our next speaker is Richael Young. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. I am much shorter than Tom, so this has to come way down. This podium also is not really made for me. But you can see, since it's clear, I do have a full body. So while my slides are coming up, so I'm Richael Young with Mammoth Trading. A little bit of Nebraska factoids for you is that the woolly mammoth is the state fossil of Nebraska, and as we got our roots started here in Nebraska, it seemed appropriate to name our company after the state fossil. All of you actually have a date tonight with the largest Columbian mammoth fossil. It's tonight at Morrill Hall. You'll be able to see it. So, and in fact, if you look at your schedule, I have to note that it's not fossil elephants, but fossil mammoths that are at this state museum. So I'm a little bit upset. I'm a little sad that Nick didn't catch that himself. But in any case, so can we go to the top of my slides, please? Yeah, you get a sneak peek. My third point. Other direction. Oh, actually, I have control of this. I'm sorry. Sorry, Eric. I can do this myself. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing, how markets relate to the value of water, and then also discuss how we might be able to evaluate some of the effectiveness of existing markets that we have today, as well as how we might evaluate whether a region is ready for a market. Markets are becoming more and more popular or of interest to people in terms of wanting to utilize them for their ability to reallocate water resources that are limited. And so I'll share some main lessons, and a lot of this work was funded by the USDA and in partnership with Water for Food. Okay, so first thinking about what markets can do and why this is valuable for us thinking about water scarcity. There are a lot of new, while necessary, regulations that are coming down and really affecting a lot of growers' bottom lines. So if we think about places like California, there has been multi-year drought there that has really had farmers turning to using groundwater. And has depleted a lot of their aquifers and causing a lot of damage. And so they're having new regulations that are coming down that are expected to have a huge impact on their economy. So one district that I was recently talking to is expecting that their consumptive use is going to have to decrease by half. So you can think about the kinds of implications that that's going to have on their local economy, which largely is surrounded by agriculture. Or supported by agriculture, but markets can help to reduce those economic impacts. So you have limited water use, and while the regulations itself can hurt farmers, markets can help to reallocate water to uses in a way that improves their bottom lines. Oops, too fast. There we go. My second point is that markets monetize conservation, and so absent markets, there's really little incentive for farmers to think about reducing their water use. Water is a really important input in farming, and so when we think about risk aversion, it's easier to apply a little bit more than a little bit less. But if there's a tool like a market or a way that you can monetize your water savings, all of a sudden the math is very different, and farmers think differently about their water use and their conservation. And of course, too, markets have been used as a tool by groups like the Nature Conservancy and like Trout Unlimited to sort of do the work, for the public trust in putting more water to environmental flows and in-stream uses. So markets can be a really powerful tool that can be used for environmental good. And then the third is that markets can increase the value of water itself. And so, here, if you have a limited amount of water, instead of just sort of keeping it in the same uses, you can move it to higher value uses that create more money for the community, more jobs, and can really help them to sustain themselves in the long term, even with regulations. As people have been thinking a lot about markets and how we might be able to scale them in new places, the USDA has been really interested in what are some of these metrics that we can use to evaluate whether water markets can be a tool that can be deployed in that region. And so Water for Food and Mammoth have been working on this for the USDA and looking at both ranging from very informal markets to very formal markets. What are these common threads, and how are markets? What are these enabling conditions that make markets work? I'll note that most water markets are indeed informal. So, we've also done work as a group looking at the state of, water trading across the Western United States. And the bulk of water markets are happening at a very informal and decentralized manner. We can perhaps get into some of this during the Q&A. But, in terms of having very, very formal markets like the ones that you see in the Murray-Darling, that's not happening so much here, but it doesn't mean that water trading isn't happening in the Western U.S. So again, we've got this growing interest. We want to look at how we can scale water markets and what these enabling conditions are. And really, there are very few, if any, tools that can help us to rapidly assess whether a region is market ready. So what we want to do here is develop a really simple and qualitative framework that can help agencies, agribusiness, nonprofits understand whether a region is market ready and help them to come to a go, no-go decision. And if the answer is that a region is not market ready, that there's a really clear way for them to understand why that is. Okay, so we've sort of boiled this down into 5 metrics, and I'm looking forward to talking about this more with the panel, and as well welcome your feedback. The 5 that we've boiled this down to is that there must be some severity in water risk. There's got to be legal and administrative readiness. There's got to be a heterogeneity or difference variation in water values, and that finally there needs to be infrastructure readiness. So I'll get to each of these in some detail. So in terms of severity of water risk, we can think of some kind of shock to the system that creates either an influx of new demand or a shortage. We can also think about supply shocks. So this can be a change in regulation. So you have a ramp down of allocations. You can have a curtailment on junior appropriators. You can have, so Nebraska and the Platte River Basin experienced some flooding in 2013. So, all of that new water was used for recharge projects. So you can think about even creating, more supply side water markets. In Texas, you have water as a byproduct to a bunch of fracking, and so there's this influx of water that can be used productively for irrigated agriculture. So that's also an addition of some new water that can be used. Of course, population growth or changing demands can also change some of the shocks to the system. So these can be, from a single drought year and having extreme drought that gives you less water and also increases your crop water demands, to really slow population increases and things like that. The second issue is legal readiness, and so here it's you have to have some kind of quantification of the water rights. So a lot of basins have an issue around quantification in that they have not yet been adjudicated. And so if you want to transfer a water right, in most states they allow you to transfer your water rights, but you have to go through a very expensive legal process where you prove up and quantify your water rights. And so already having the process where the water rights are quantified, they've been adjudicated, and they are in fact transferable legally is really, really helpful to having market readiness. Now, there are more complex considerations if you're looking at things like moving surface water and changing it into groundwater. So that's for recharge, for example. So there was a lot of coordination between Nebraska's Department of Natural Resources with local natural resources districts in order to get recharge projects going on. That's also true in places like the Kern County Water Bank in California. There are also examples of turning groundwater into surface water, and so there was a lease program in the Central Platte Natural Resources District in Nebraska in which the Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program was leasing groundwater to supplement surface water flows. And then there are also issues too around change of use. So if you change it from an agricultural use to an urban use, you're going to have more complicated processes that are involved in that. And so looking at those legal considerations, it just depends exactly what you're looking to do. There's also, you have to look at the administrative readiness. Monitoring and enforcement is hugely important. Being able to ensure that the water can move from the seller to the buyer, being able to shepherd that water is really important. So this was a huge issue with the Upper Colorado River Basin. They were doing what was called the System Conservation Pilot Program. And one of the issues there was that they were having a really difficult time with monitoring and enforcement and being able to ensure that the water that they had actually leased from those water users was making its way downstream into some of the lower reservoirs. So monitoring and enforcement is really critical to ensure that the buyer is able to get the water that the buyer is leased. And then also on the administrative side, having an efficient process for review and approval is important. A lot of agencies will, so for example, the Washington State Department of Ecology is responsible for approving transfers, but they do a case-by-case evaluation of their private water rights transfers and have such a huge backlog that it can really price out a lot. It basically makes it impossible to do lease transfers. Having a heterogeneity or some difference in the value of water through space and time is really important. And this isn't just true, if you think about Nebraska and think, oh, it's completely homogeneous in its cropping, but actually there can be a bit of difference in the value of water depending on what type of soil you have. So if you compare something like a really sandy soil in which water just leaks right through, it doesn't stay in that crop's root zone, you can use a ton of water in a place like that versus where if you have a finer soil, it sticks in that root zone, and so you can actually use a lot less water for growing the same crops. So having some differences in water values can depend on crops. It could be a mix of ag and urban uses. It could be a difference in soil types. The important thing, too, is to have also some amount of flexibility in your water use. So there are some regions where they have very hardened demand. So again, a place like the California Central Valley is increasingly having hardened demand because they're moving more and more to permanent cropping. And so that makes it really difficult to be able to lease water away from something flexible like an annual crop and putting it onto a permanent crop. And then finally, infrastructure readiness. I've had several people come talk to me about wanting to start a water market, and what they're actually talking about is building infrastructure to bring new supply to their area. Creating new infrastructure, laying concrete is really, really expensive. And so if, we're evaluating whether a region is ready for a market, most of that infrastructure really has to be in place or it's not, or it becomes cost prohibitive. Now, just a note, and I have a picture of, I think this is the CVP system, the Central Valley Project in California. Sometimes the existing infrastructure might be there, but could be so cost prohibitive to utilize that it can also price out some water markets transfers. So I'm not going to read this to you. The point is that what we're trying to do here is develop almost a traffic light system, green, yellow, red, and understanding whether in each of these 5 metrics, if a region is ready, if it has high readiness, medium, or low, and that just through some very, rather surface level knowledge, you should be able to assess the readiness of a region in each of these categories. Now, when we're doing this kind of evaluation, what we ultimately recommend is that you don't move forward with deploying a market if you have a single low score or more than 2 medium scores. Now, this is also more of a qualitative analysis, so you might want to do some more quantitative analysis as part of this. And then, of course, there are some other factors that get played into this, including buyer liquidity. Buying water rights can be really expensive. A lot of times they're just cash transactions. And so being able to get the financing from a lender sometimes is impossible. So thinking about things like buyer liquidity, your deployment strategy, how you're going to let water users know that this new water market is available. Transactions costs, we can get into some of the transactions costs more during the Q&A, and then the structure and administration. These are all things that also play into it, but play perhaps a little bit more of a minor role than the first 5 that we talked about. So just to go through one quick example with you, it's the California Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. And I'm picking on my home state, of course, but I want to just because water markets are coming up a lot in the region, we can just sort of go through this quickly. They have really high water risk. They have new regulations that are coming down under their new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. In terms of their legal readiness, though, it's really low. They haven't even defined their groundwater allocations. They're having a difficult time understanding how to even set those given their very complex water rights administration system. And of course, they don't have any rules or regulations that allow or would govern transfers at this point. They have low administrative readiness. They're not funded to be able to do this yet. And then in terms of their heterogeneity of water values, it's generally quite high. There's a mix of different permanent and annual crops, and that they generally have high infrastructure readiness too. And this is especially true for groundwater trading. Normally in groundwater trading, you're not actually, and there are exceptions to this, but in groundwater trading, you're normally not physically transporting the buyer or the water from seller to buyer. You're trading allocations or permits, pieces of paper, and so there's some accounting to be done there. But if you're pumping within the same subbasin, there's really no infrastructure that's required. So with that, I will wrap up, and we can chat some more during Q&A. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Our final speaker this morning before we get to the panel questions is Dustin Garrick. Dustin is going to give us a little bit more of a global view of what's happening with water transactions based on experiences on multiple continents. So thank you, Dustin.
To thank Nick and the organizers for the tremendous job of convening us all, and say how much I've been looking forward to coming here to Nebraska and the discussions that we're all going to have together. I realized from the previous two speakers I also need an obligatory Nebraska story, and I was really struggling with that. I'm born and raised in Georgia, which has become a very important irrigation hotspot, but my connection to Nebraska is through my PhD advisor, Adela Schlager, who was born and raised here and worked on groundwater management, and really shaped my perspective on the work that I'll be sharing with you today. She focuses on institutions and how strengthening institutions and incentives is needed in order to manage common pool resources like water. And today, what I want to do in our session on the value of water is to argue that valuing water better is fundamentally about strengthening institutions and incentives to better generate and share the benefits that water can create. Okay, so it seems like my slides are up now. As Nick mentioned, I'm going to share some global perspectives, but I did want to also highlight one point around my origin story is that I did my PhD at the University of Arizona and initially worked on the Colorado River Basin and Bureau of Europe Reclamation funded project, which was being developed around the time shortage sharing regulations or guidelines were being developed in the early 2000s. And at the time of presenting my PhD proposal, I was interested in the use of market mechanisms and market-based instruments as a means of restoring water to the Colorado River Delta. So in 2002, I went to my PhD committee and proposed this topic, and I was told, one, it's the most overstudied problem in the world, and two, it's hopeless. So that tells you what you should listen to about academics, because for those who are not familiar with the story, the epilogue is that over the ensuing years, the states, the federal government, and eventually binational negotiations between U.S. and Mexico developed a number of agreements, including one that would deliver flood pulses to the Colorado River Delta that were built on some prior efforts and experiments with market-based approaches and incentives. And it shows that these processes often take a long period to get to readiness. And what I want to do today is really emphasize three things. First is how we frame the challenges and the conflicts associated with scarce water resources. Second is some lessons based on examples of long-term observatories of water allocation reform, both in the US, Australia, and in other places internationally. And in the end, raise some questions as we explore scalable solutions and incentive-based approaches for managing freshwater scarcity. So my work has focused on three interrelated challenges. If you work from left, the first is allocating water between human and environmental needs. And here you see the picture of the Murray-Darling Basin, which has already been referenced several times, as an example of a large-scale, long-term reform project designed to balance water demands between, in principle, irrigation and environmental needs, ecosystem needs for wetlands and in-stream values. Second, in the middle, you see a picture of the city of Monterrey in northern Mexico, which has urbanized and expanded rapidly over the last 50 years. And as the city has expanded, so has its water supply system, including increasing competition between cities and agriculture for water. And my work is focusing in particular on the nature of competition between cities and agriculture and the different responses to it. And then finally, what you see is the challenge of sharing water across jurisdictions, whether between states or across country and political borders. And in most cases, these three interrelated challenges are being confronted simultaneously as you try to balance water for people and nature, as you try to navigate competition between cities and agriculture, as well as within each of those sectors. And then finally, as you do that across large systems that cross multiple political borders. I want to, in the context of our discussion today, given the fact that we bring together experts on water and experts in food, emphasize some recent results that we've generated, a global picture of competition between cities and agriculture from some work that's been funded by the World Bank and the Nature Conservancy, which is designed to try to understand the scale of the challenge globally as rapid urbanization and irrigation development many places have entered into a collision course. And what you see here are the results from the study that was published earlier this month that was focusing on rural water for thirsty cities, and particularly the experience of water reallocation as a response to growing urbanization. Urban populations have increased from 1 billion to 4 billion over the last 50 years, and are projected to increase by 2.5 billion additional urban dwellers by 2050, and increasingly in places like Africa and Asia with the least capacity to address these challenges. At the same time, existing irrigation development and projected irrigation development are projected to lead to competition between cities and agriculture. And our work shows a spectrum, if you look at the slide here, from water reallocation happening with land use change as urbanization leads to changes in land use and changes to the water use on those lands. And then at the other end of the spectrum, experiences with interbasin transfers or large-scale transfers of water through pipelines and other new infrastructure that are designed to reallocate water from rural regions and surrounding hinterlands of cities to meet the needs of growing urban populations. And what we did in this global picture is we showed that this is a significant challenge already. We estimate, based on the documented studies of 69 cities with 103 reallocation projects, that approximately 16 billion cubic meters of water per year are flowing from rural areas to urban areas. And to give you a sense of scale, my benchmark is the Colorado River, which has an annual flow of about 18.5 billion cubic meters of water per year. And so you have a sense that this is already a significant challenge. This water is traveling approximately 13,000 kilometers. And it is projected to only grow as the urban populations increase in places like Africa and Asia, where the capacity to respond and to share water is most limited in terms of the institutions and incentives in place. And so we see this as a real call to action to better understand the nature of these challenges and to identify the types of institutions, the types of infrastructure, the types of data and governance that will be needed in order to better share these benefits. What I want to do in the remaining time is really take a brief tour of some global experiences and highlight a few of the lessons associated with water allocation reform in places that I'm describing as observatories. These are places where we're able to understand and track the evolution of water allocation over long periods of time and understand really what is their path to readiness, or what are the barriers that have impeded readiness for more sustainable, flexible, incentive-based water allocation systems. And so I'll highlight these briefly and then illustrate these points through a few examples. The first is to redefine the boundaries. We're often looking at local water management challenges within our community, within our sector. These observatories have demonstrated the need to redefine the boundaries and take a systems perspective to better share benefits. So in the case of competition between cities and agriculture for water, it's important to see cities as part of urban-rural systems rather than looking at the boundaries of the city itself. And through that, to better incorporate surrounding rural areas, hinterlands, agricultural producers into decision-making around water allocation. The second point is to get the numbers right and to get the right numbers right. We often hear, as an academic, the best conclusion of any study is to say more research is needed, more data is needed. I'm here to tell you a different story today, and that is it's important to get the numbers right, but to get the right numbers right and focus on the types of data that are going to be most pivotal to developing effective water allocation. And particularly when you're dealing with water reallocation, you're dealing with water reallocation between an urban sector, which is often economically diversified and wealthier, and an agricultural sector which may be negatively impacted if that reallocation isn't done in an equitable way, that you have a focus on things like third-party impacts, and when you're developing these water allocation reforms, also ensuring that there's enforcement and tracking that the water that is being moved is actually being delivered, as we've just heard. The third is to focus on vested interests and to focus on those who stand to lose from reallocation. So I call it the inconvenient trust, which is to look at the political economy of water reallocation, not to hide from this reality because it will come back to bite. And that is the idea of addressing vested interests and trying to include those users who will be negatively impacted, including informal users. One of the things that we focus on, particularly in an international context, is the informal users are invisible. So ignoring them is very problematic from a poverty and equity standpoint. And the fourth point is that many of these processes of reform are decadal processes. Even in the Murray-Darling Basin, where I've spent about a 10-year period of research, the water markets there, which have created so much value, are a 30-year overnight success. And so it really emphasizes this point that you hear policymakers mention regularly is you don't want to waste a crisis. And you want to harness opportunities related to drivers like urbanization, like droughts, like fiscal surpluses and budgets, like political changes. But you don't want to wait for them because the rush decisions can prove risky. And then the final one I've called balanced portfolios, but it might as well be developing stronger coordination institutions. Oftentimes, once we get the reforms in place, we focus on implementing deals, but we lose sight of strengthening the institutions, reinforcing those enabling conditions to get to scale. So I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, but I've got 3 or 4 stories that illustrate how these different lessons have come together. And I guess one thing that I will emphasize is that it's really important that we crowdsource more of these lessons using common frameworks, concepts, ideas, learning each other's language. And the geographer James Westcott talked about how in the 21st century we're going to need a global circulation of ideas. And many of the ways that were in the 20th century developed by the kind of global circulation of different types of models of infrastructure, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority. So with water allocation, we have a tremendous amount to learn, and we don't just need to focus on the successful models, but also what's failed or what's struggled and how to learn from those challenges. So in the first story, I want to focus on the city of Monterey again. Here you see the rapid urbanization from a period in 1950 of around 300,000 people to a period of 1990 with almost 3 million people. And the picture on the left is the urban boundaries, and this is the sprawl of the urban boundaries over that period. And an urban planner would look at this and they would stop. But a water planner would focus on the right side and show how that urban boundary, which is depicted in yellow, is only a very small fraction of the regional water supply system. And the story of El Cuchillo Dam, which was developed in the early 1990s, is an important lesson because we can now look after 25 years of implementation experience at some of these lessons that were just presented coming through. First is you redefine the boundaries. You have a shift from the city as the boundary to the city as part of an urban-rural system. When this project was first developed, it was developed by national and federal government, and it led to significant resistance from downstream farmers who were going to be impacted by this project. It led to La Guerra de Agua, the water war, and significant conflicts which were associated with the departure of one of the governors in the state of Nuevo León. What happened over the ensuing period was that the downstream farmers were successful in working with the city and with the national government to develop a scheme and set of compensation mechanisms in order to benefit from all of the new infrastructure capacity, things like flood control and other kinds of benefits, as well as compensation from treated wastewater to ensure irrigation productivity, as well as direct payments that could facilitate the adjustment, particularly for those farms that were going to be left out. Over time now, the downstream farmers see this project as their project, and now the idea has been that compensation has shifted from a perspective of compensating the individual to sharing benefits across the region. I'll move on, but what there are other points emphasized when you look at the lessons related to, for example, getting the numbers right, dealing with inconvenient trust, is that it really emphasized getting the right kinds of information to support the governance that would be needed for adaptation over the long term. The next story is to take it from Australia, where you really have a success, but a mixed success in the terms of developing incentives for sustainable water use and the development of a mature water market. Here you have the same picture of the Murray-Darling Basin, and you can see, if you focus now a little bit more in detail, that you have a wetland and you have an agricultural community, which both depend and are interdependent on the Murray-Darling Basin and its long-term sustainability. On the right side, you see a context for the basin as a whole, and there's a lot happening in this this chart, which was presented in a paper by Quinton Grafton and Sarah Wheeler, two Australian experts, last year, where they looked at the economics of the water recovery and focused in particular on the red line, which show you the changes in diversions over time from a period in the late 1990s, when the region was just entering into drought, through the early 2000s, where the region experienced the millennium drought, and into the most recent decade, where there was a period of flooding and a long-term effort to recover water for the environment. And what you can see here is that the red line of diversions had decreased significantly during the drought period because water availability was lower. And the miracle of the market was often said that although in its worst year, that water availability declined by about 70%, the gross value in irrigated agricultural production only reduced by about 20% in commodity price adjusted terms. The market facilitated reallocation to those higher valued economic purposes. In terms of allocating water within irrigation, and over that time period, there's a significant success. In terms of balancing between irrigation and environment, success has been more mixed. If you focus on the blue line, the dark blue line, in the period from 2010 forward, you see an increase in water recovery up to 2,000 gigaliters, which is around the amount estimated as necessary for sustainable diversions in the region, up to a target initially estimated up to 3,000 to 4,000 gigaliters needed for sustainability. And what you can see is, despite the recovery of water, the blue bars, which give you a kind of indicator of how much water is reaching to the Murray mouth, an indicator of the ecological viability of the system, we're still at a relatively low level, and this has led to significant challenges. And so in the case of the Murray-Darling Basin, it really emphasizes how important it is to develop the strong coordination institutions and to provide the capacity to both achieve incentives for sustainable irrigation, as well as balance that with environmental health over the long term. I think I'm going to be running short on time, so I want to skip ahead to one other example from the Murray-Darling Basin, which is that associated with one project within the basin, associated with trying to take advantage of investments in irrigation efficiency to facilitate the reallocation from agricultural users to provide a drought insurance supply for the city of Melbourne during the millennium drought. And in this situation, you have a very good example of the need to prepare for the crises when they occur. In this situation here, you have on the northern part of the map the Goulburn Irrigation Valley, and this is one of the larger irrigation districts where there was a strong need for financing to modernize this irrigation system and to increase the productivity of the irrigation system. And during the Millennium Drought in 2007, as water availability for the city of Melbourne was declining, there was what was described by the state of Victoria in this region, their politicians, as a once-in-a-100-year opportunity to provide that financing for irrigation modernization by tapping into the need for more significant water supplies in the city of Melbourne to invest in that irrigation modernization. And in this example, the redefined the boundaries of the system to go beyond the irrigation district to include the statewide water security and to include the benefits that could be created for the city of Melbourne in achieving this drought insurance. And in the process, the city of Melbourne was willing to commit to the financing, and the irrigators saw this as a tremendous opportunity of developing the financing needed for their modernization. However, in the process, the project went from approval to implementation within a 6-month period, and lacked the time to do the full scale of studies and the engagement with the full range of irrigators who would be impacted by this project. And despite the potential for there to be increased benefits and sharing, after the project was fully constructed in the 3-year period after its initial approval, the initial reaction from the new politicians was to restrict the pipeline from actually delivering water to Melbourne, and there have been continued questions around the water savings and the other kinds of modernization advances in the initial region. And it showed the importance of harnessing those opportunities by better preparing the technical analysis and the engagement needed to sustain these reform processes even after the crisis subsides. So in summary, I wanted to emphasize these lessons as some kind of examples that will need to be considered as we identify and address the barriers to scalable solutions for freshwater scarcity, and to raise the kinds of questions that many regions will be considering around where are markets and incentives actually applicable and which types are fit to the different contexts. What does readiness mean, for example, in a given context, and how to achieve it with the various types of markets or incentives, including public and private investment in increased irrigation efficiency. The second is to consider what are the pathways, what kinds of types and sequences of institutional reforms, infrastructure development, information systems will be needed in order to unlock this potential. And then finally, scalability will require that we have a very direct and honest discussion around the types of barriers that I referenced earlier, and to identify how to overcome those barriers, as well as to benchmark progress. Even in a place like Australia, you'll see that there's mixed success when we bring in the full range of indicators and metrics. With that, I think I want to make sure and stay within my time and look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thank you, Dustin. I now invite our 3 speakers to come up to the front. And while the audience is getting their questions together, I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I hope cut across all the speakers' interests. So, and I'm happy with any of you to answer these, but so the first question really is some practical advice. And again, all of you have experience on the ground. One of the questions that we're asked very often is, you have a water manager or come up to you and say, we've heard about water markets, we want to implement. So given everything that you've learned globally, what advice can you give? What's the most important thing to get right? And
So I'll start by, I think that if someone had come to me and asked that, and many have, especially in California these days, the bit of advice that I've shared is a piece of advice that my parents have shared with me year in and year out, which is that you're really just not that special. Like, there are so many people who have done this kind of work and have implemented markets in the past that there's a wealth of experience that's out there to learn from, and that there isn't a need to reinvent the wheel. And so I think a lot of folks, when they're interested in developing markets, have this tendency to just want to do it themselves. But there are so many really clever solutions that you can borrow from other examples where they're dealing with very similar types of problems. And there are also some really big lessons from failure too that folks can avoid just by looking at what others have done and pitfalls that they've fallen into. So I'd say that there is this wealth of experience and expertise, and that you could really leapfrog by tapping into that.
I have been asked that question a few times, and it's great when we get that question. I love that question, and we can help them. I agree with Richael that there are a lot of examples to point to say it's, in some ways it feels like a novel or risky frontier, but in some ways it's happening in a lot of places, and we can show how it can deliver benefits. One of the big things for us, though, is also, if someone is coming to ask you that question, maybe you're in safer terrain, but one of the things for us is clarifying the misconceptions about markets, or the fear of markets, or addressing some of the cultural issues with markets. In the Nature Conservancy, I think in the Western United States, people are more receptive to that term. But when we talk with our Africa program or our India program, it's a difficult conversation. It's almost a non-starter. And so, that's part of it for us, is not just talking about markets, but talking about this set of incentives and how it can help to achieve a better outcome.
Asking the academic to give practical advice is always risky, but I'm going to try to be very direct here and just say you need to have a discussion with the farmers, understand how they're managing risk, and how ideas around markets, incentives, the full range of tools could either threaten their operations or lead to new opportunities. And once there's an understanding, particularly of those who are going to be most negatively impacted, is to have those discussions around how to facilitate the change.
Perfect, thank you. So I have one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So one word that I know underpins all of your work, but I don't think any of you used in your presentations, is trust. And so I want to come to the role of trust in building institutions in particular. And what I'd like you to do is reflect each on some of the informal transfer and reallocation institutions that you've worked on, and think about what is it about those informal institutions that often occur even when they're not allowed that builds trust. And I'll ask you, Dustin, maybe to talk a little bit about your work on the urban water transfers, Richael to focus on the agricultural side, and Tom to focus on the environmental side. And then after that, we'll move to the audience questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'll jump in, I guess, since you pointed to me first, to first say that I did mention trust. The inconvenient trust, in fact, in dealing with vested interests and what have you.
Stand corrected.
And in fact, I really appreciated your question, because one of the examples that I had as a kind of backup was some work that we're starting up in Kenya now, which is based on understanding the role of informal water markets and meeting the needs for rapidly growing towns and cities in northwestern Kenya and some of the poorest and driest parts of Kenya. And trust is a particularly important issue there. When we're talking about informal water markets, it's a much different idea than I think what we've been having in our discussion now. We're focusing on small-scale water service, private water service providers, and to put in your mind basically a tanker truck, a motorcycle, or even someone pushing a handcart full of water to deliver for domestic and/or commercial needs within the city and region associated with Lodwar in northwestern Kenya. And trust is a fascinating aspect of building the institutions in this region, because the consumers of water don't trust the public utility because they haven't had reliable water services. And so these informal water vendors, these informal water markets have literally emerged in to fill the gap. When you have a discussion with partners on the ground around how the utility and the region is meeting the needs of this rapidly growing city, the informal vendors do not come up in a formal workshop at all. But in our work, what we've been trying to do is to try to make the informal vendors visible and to understand the role that they play in extending the water supply network. And what's happened in the process is actually facilitated some really interesting discussions around institution building between the informal vendors and the public utility, and the synergies between their work, the ways in which coordination between these two roles can lead to better outcomes, including the fact, for example, that our initial monitoring suggests that the water sales from the public utility to these informal vendors constitutes as much as 1/3 of the revenue that the utility receives. That's never been a line item in the budget, but it becomes a huge, potential for a virtuous cycle, which gets reinvested in the public utility and also leads to new opportunities within the sector. And so, to come back to the term of trust, there needs to be a forum within which these informal vendors can actually feel comfortable and confident in having the discussion and not feeling that this is a threat to their businesses, and vice versa in terms of the utility.
I'd say in the agricultural setting, the biggest issue around trust is usually around price. So there is a lot of sense that prices of water in trading should be disclosed, and that a lot of water markets also are administered by the regulatory agency itself. And that a lot of growers have discomfort around disclosing the value of their water to the very entity that regulates it. And so here's a way in which perhaps I'm biased, but I think the private sector can play a really important role to provide some confidentiality around bid and ask prices, and to make sure that prices are discovered in a way that is equitable and fair. And something that comes up a lot too is how entities come to agree on a price, and that if you have a structure where people are participating in a water transaction through an auction, that the buyers will outbid each other on a single water right, and that the seller is able to extract all of those gains of trade, and that the buyer extracts very little of those gains from trade. And so it's very asymmetrical in the way that they're able to split the benefits of that transaction. And that happens just the opposite for reverse auctions. Sometimes you can have really large growers who have bargaining power and can drive down prices. And so the way in which people negotiate prices can also be a really big one, and how accessible or equitable that markets can be. So it usually comes down to price, I'd say.
I did not say trust. I will admit it, Nick. But it is important, and I did talk about it a bit. I think people can be suspicious. Certainly, agriculture can be suspicious of environmentalists, and maybe for good reason historically. And part of what I talked about is that the Nature Conservancy recognizing it's not just about what can we do for rivers or aquifers or species, but it's about how does it fit in this broader set of uses in the water sector, the agricultural needs, the urban needs, the bigger basin scale interests and values associated with water. And so I think we're doing better at that. And for the Nature Conservancy, it comes back to being a community-based organization and working with farmers and people in that community, and that's how you build that trust over time. Just one other comment on trust. Having been with the government, the federal government also is probably not the most trusted partner in water. I don't know. And, I think to that Colorado River example, I think they are earning more trust by showing that they are being responsive to the interests and needs of those water users and those states. For example, by investing money in some of the solutions that the states are developing, or reoperating some of the big facilities like Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam to try to help accomplish the goals that they've identified in their drought contingency planning. So it's probably not a silver bullet, but in both of those cases, I think it's continually demonstrating a commitment to the broader interests in a basin.
Thank you. All right, well, so with that, we'll open the floor to questions. I guess the first hand was up here. There we go.
So I'd just like to follow up with Tom for a second, and I suppose the others can answer this too if you have opinions. But here in the Platte Basin, a lot of environmental value is driven by the Endangered Species Act. So what other than the Endangered Species Act comes into play in determining the value of water for environment, both here and elsewhere?
Yeah, and that's true in many cases, and we looked at that when I was with the federal government. There are a lot of cases where projects are being operated in a way that's driven in part by the Endangered Species Act. There are a lot of values that we look at, ecosystem values that we think are contributed by the environment. Certainly having watershed health, providing clean water, providing recreational amenities, a broader set of values other than regulatory drivers. And part of what we're trying to do is show through these investment strategies that you can realize the value of those investments and those assets. And that's what we do in something like the Murray-Darling Basin, or when we're participating in water markets, we're trying to put a price or a value on that asset and demonstrate its value in these environmental purposes. So I'm not sure that that is satisfactory to you yet. No, absolutely not. And in some cases, we certainly participate in projects where there's an endangered species issue, but it's more about how do we find solutions that are more market or incentive oriented. There are a variety of approaches for environmental groups. Ours is more investment oriented. If you look at the Nature Conservancy in our history, it was about buying and protecting land, and we carry that through in our work in water as well. Investment. So let's look at some of these questions here where you're looking at a basin scale and thinking about what are the set of issues and interests, what are the water scarcity drivers, and that to us is an entry point. I wouldn't call it crisis as the sole opportunity, but there is a need for players in basins, including the Platte, to think about how water is allocated. And when we can enter that conversation and be a part of it and figure out some of these solutions that also help to enhance the environment through some of these investment strategies, that's what we're trying to accomplish. It looks like Dustin and Richael might also have some opinions on this and could help me out of this jam.
Well, I think it's a good question. This is still a regulatory example, but it's a different alliance. In the case of the Deschutes River Basin in Central Oregon, where the big driver was rapid land use change, urbanization, residential developments around Bend, relying on groundwater development, which was impairing on the surface water rights required for irrigators in the region. And so you ended up having an alliance between irrigators who wanted their senior water rights protected and the conservation groups who were interested in maintaining or restoring water for resident fisheries in the region. And so it was in that context of actually realizing that there was a potential alliance and there was a threat posed by groundwater development, that mitigation requirements and regulation through that were imposed. And that happened, of course, to deal with the groundwater issue, but it also happened because you had a river conservancy, kind of place-based organization, which was convening all these different interests and parties and actually facilitating discussion around where their mutual interests lie. Because the residential developers also needed some certainty in trying to understand what the regulatory environment was going to be like related to groundwater development. So in that case, that was just one of the strategies used alongside a number of others where conservation groups were leasing or transferring water, investing in irrigation efficiencies and things of this nature. And I think investing in irrigation efficiency would be another one of those kinds of potential win-win opportunities where there's a chance to either increase or maintain productivity with the same or less water without necessarily having that kind of regulatory driver, because these other interests have the financing capacity to support irrigation and also the environment at the same time.
Yeah, I would say that, certainly the Endangered Species Act has been a really important driver in water use restrictions and in groundwater restrictions, not just in Nebraska, but in Texas and California and Washington. And so there, I think it's been a great catalyst for for water use regulation and improved management. And I think that, you know, groups like the Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, other environmental nonprofits have been playing a really important role in trying to bring us back to maybe a fully appropriated status rather than this sort of history of over-appropriation that we have in the American West. I mean, we have, you know, our states have issued too many water rights and too many permits to use water, such that in even an average year, we're using more than really is available and can support a healthy ecosystem. And so, you know, they're using private dollars to help us to get back to where we have these healthy ecosystems. And, you know, I hope that more state regulatory agencies and local agencies will start playing a more active role in achieving the public trust that that we're supposed to be meeting in so many states. But you know, I'd say that Endangered Species Act has been an important driver for sure.
Thank you. I think, was there a question here?
Pricing was mentioned earlier, and I think price certainly sends a message about value. And that bottle of water that's in front of you costs about $1,000 to $4,000 per cubic meter, whereas you can get the same bottle of water from the tap for less than $1 per cubic meter. Why do we do this? Because, you know, it's convenience or whatever has got that much value for us. The federal government provides water in California at a fraction of even the $1 per cubic meter value to the farmers, and sends a message that way about the value of that water, which results in inefficient use in general. And we've seen that all over California. So I think the federal government and the state have got a great role in sending the right message in terms of value of water for transfer. Certainly markets, competition, negotiations have a big role in determining price, but so does the federal government and the environmental groups.
You know, I certainly was concerned and still am about, you know, some of the historic decisions and commitments that have been made by the federal government and what they say about the value of water. Because you're right, they underprice essentially or underrepresent the value of water in the way that water is allocated. But, you know, I think the opportunity here is to look at the challenges that we face and recognize that it's a different era. And to me, the role that the federal government can play is to helping to facilitate a greater appreciation of the value in water, including through pricing and through markets. And so I don't expect the federal government to go back and reprice water or change the price of water to reflect what its current societal value is. But I think you can achieve that if you are flexible in letting water users make decisions through market or incentive-based approaches. And I hope the federal government will at least accommodate that as a way to recognize the true value of water, certainly that we face when we're looking at water scarcity today.
I'm going to jump in with a quick comment there. California is, of course, a fascinating case, and a lot of us work there. California is, I believe, the only place in the world so far where agricultural water users have outbid urban water users in water markets. And so it's an interesting case because, at least on the margin, the value of water in agriculture in California is so high. I suspect that the next case where that will happen is Colorado with some of the greenhouse products that are there. But it's a really interesting, you know, there are points in space and time where agricultural water users are very high. I didn't mean to interrupt, Richael, if you'd like to add another.
I mean, it's a tough subject because I also think that a lot of those federal and state subsidies to create those projects have also, you know, we have dividends on that as the public, which is that we have really cheap food and we have really productive agriculture. And so, you know, it's a double-edged sword, no doubt. I will say, though, that I think that there's this misconception that people do not pay for water, but I work mostly with groundwater irrigators, and that the electric prices or the energy prices to pump that water and to irrigate can be quite high. And so there are some incentives there for conserving just to reduce your energy bill. And that just completely gets lost in a lot of the discussion around thinking about the cost of water, or how much you're investing into that.
Well, I guess I should comment briefly, which is, to say that I think your point's really well taken, and it reflects the fact that there are multiple values of water as well as multiple ways of valuing water, and I think Richael captured the fact that many times these decisions around infrastructure and around pricing and cost recovery are accounting for things like regional development, subsidizing these kinds of regional development or economic development pathways, and building in some of those considerations. When you're dealing with domestic water pricing, you're considering issues of affordability and other considerations in this regard. And so I think that it's just important to recognize that it's not simply price as a signal for efficient water use, but also for these equity and sustainability considerations as well.
Points. We have a question at the back here.
Thank you. Neil Woolen from the National Strategic Research Institute at the University of Nebraska. You've talked a little bit about water scarcity and the impact on the ecosystems and the potential change. Is the water profession coupling with public health to also look at potentials for emerging pathogens that are tied to water-related issues in an area and potentially as a predictive value? One question. The second is looking at both regional and community resilience, secondary to a large-scale accident or intentional contamination of surface water. What degree of planning consideration is being given to that, and who's responsible for coming in after something like that to help deal with the problem from impact assessment, mitigation, and then getting back to restoration of operations and helping that area, that region, or that community deal with their problem?
Dustin.
That's a really important question. It's well beyond my expertise, but I think it emphasizes when we're talking around markets and incentive-based approaches, is they are bounded. I mean, they're bounded by the institutions, the regulations, the decisions making that address a whole range of public health and other considerations. And I would say that this is, from my perspective and my experience, well beyond those boundaries of where markets can address. Now there are. With that kind of said, the caveat that there have been experiments with water quality trading and with certain kinds of contamination, non-point source, diffuse pollution, and trying to develop tradable permit schemes, but that doesn't deal with the kinds of risks that you're describing, which I think are in the realm of risk assessment, public health, and other areas of policy. So that's my main comment.
I actually did have something to say on this. Sorry. But like Dustin, I would say that, the environmental community, I don't think has made all the connections that we could with public health. And I talked about how I think we've broadened our mission and recognized some of these other values, but we don't have the capacity or relationships yet in the public health space. And it was illustrated, Dustin, I tried to put together a proposal with Dustin to look at water markets and potential connections to public health. And we realized we didn't really have the capacity to kind of make the case for how we would work on the public health side of that equation. So I hope there's more opportunity to build that up. It's something we've continued to work on. We do have some health experts in the Nature Conservancy, but there's a lot more work for us to do there. And on community resilience, I was just going to say, give a pitch to a group I'm sure you know, the National Drought Mitigation Center. And I've done a lot of work with them, more on drought resilience rather than pathogens, but thinking about how do communities build resilience for these events. And I will just say it's probably a local decision. It depends on some of those local entities, or there can be different scales for building resilience. But there is global interest certainly across the Conservancy. People starting to think in that mindset and working in their communities to approach these issues in that way.
Well, thank you. So I want to take the opportunity to ask one quick last question of each of you. If one thing could be done to facilitate incentive-based management in water, what should it be and who should do it? Just a quick question.
This might be unpopular, but I'd say full-scale adjudication of water rights, and that the state regulatory agencies should be the one to do it.
Can you repeat the question?
What's one thing that could be done to make water transfers or incentive-based management more effective, and who should do it?
It's not a single thing. I think the thing that will drive this, and the place where this will find its utility, is in, well, I don't want to say crisis, but it's in confronting this challenge. I think in a lot of these places, we show the maps of water scarcity, but basically what that is places where they are facing challenges, they have over-allocated a resource, and there is increasing competition, and they're struggling with how do we solve this challenge. And you know, I think thinking at that scale and thinking about new ways to solve that problem is what's going to do it. So it's not like a single mechanism, but that's the thing that gives me hope, is that we're seeing more and more places that are recognizing this challenge and looking for solutions. And I think we've got something to offer here in the way that we talk about incentives. And if we can deliver that message and show them that it works, that it's happening in places, I think that can really increase our impact here.
Well, I think that you know, the idea of investing in, you know, a single silver bullet has already been tested and failed enough, and there's been a real risky tendency to focus on what one informant in my research in the Columbia Basin described as a surgical strike mentality. You know, you just go in, you implement deals, or you pluck the low-hanging fruit or things of this nature, and it really ends up, you know, preventing, foreclosing long-term scalable solutions. So, I mean, the one thing to do is the more general thing to do, which is invest in the institutions, and that's going to take local character. In terms of the scale of doing that, it's going to depend on, you know, the nature, the extent of that water scarcity and what kinds of users are being impacted. It may be where, you know, you've rapidly growing city, looking at that city in that region, like a Southern Nevada Water Authority or some kind of regional authority, which is the forum that needs to kind of provide, you know, some negotiation space. In other cases, you're going to be looking at a basin level, you know, and trying to manage it at that scale. But it's investing in institutions, and I would say we do have an opportunity, as Tom emphasized, is trying to build this kind of network of observatories, trying to learn more systematically from each other, to speak the same language so that we can do that, and to bridge the divide between researchers and practitioners. And then, as I say, you have to invest in more research.
So with that concludes our session. Please join me in thanking our speakers.